into actually opening up some of the real technical details and the deep dive in this as well. I really appreciate Jack and Andrew and Joe giving that wonderful introduction. One of the challenges that you have in these kinds of things is trying to figure out how much level setting you have to do up front when you have an hour to present before you start doing the deep dive here. So that's going to be one of the challenges we're going to have to figure out where that point is, but we do want to get down into the deep technical at some point in this presentation. Know that we are publishing all the content that you see here, along with blogs and all of our technical artifacts, to our website. Okay, and what we would like to do in the future, we're going to continue to publish that. We'd like you to start to engage us through that website with comments that we will address, between these plenary events, so that we don't have to wait and do the fire hose approach for you here. So at the introduction of the Birds of a Feather, I gave this little chart out here. The focus, I'm not going to go through this whole thing, but this is where we see the framework, the fundamental way we look at solving this kind of problem at this kind of scale is going to need a new approach and some new technologies. And I think there's a lot of buzz about trust marks. There's a lot of mystery what they are because they're new. And what we're going to try to do here is to give you an inside look at, and we're living this day to day. We've got engineers in rooms that are tearing through a lot of the existing standards that are out there, comparing, trying to factor out common components, arguing with each other, eating pizza and drinking Coke and all that kind of a thing, to do a lot of the down detailed work here. So, sure.
Can you give us a one-sentence definition of a trust mark?
One sentence, I'll give you more than a one-sentence definition. Okay. Sure. So the question was, can you give us a one-sentence definition of a trust mark? So I'm going to reserve the right to answer that question at the end of the Birds of a Feather. And if I still need to do that, I will do that. If that's...
It would be really nice if we had some context.
Okay. So in a... Oh, okay. So give me 2 slides, and I think I'll start to show you what some examples might be. So if you look at this slide right here, the idea is that trust frameworks that are out there today are monolithic. There's lots of dimensions that you have to get agreement, and you have to demonstrate that you fulfill to be a member of typically a federation. And we view trust marks as a piece of that agreement that's machine readable, asserted by a third party, much like if you look in the PKI world, a digital certificate is asserted by a third party, a certificate authority, and it means basically a binding between a policy and a set of due diligence that was done to an identity or to an end user. Trust marks can represent lots of different things, not just the binding of a certificate to identity. You can represent, trust marks can represent whether you conform to a particular spec, what kind of attributes you use, what kind of legal policies you would adhere to, what kind of privacy policy you adhere to. So hopefully as we go through this, you'll see some concrete examples. Yes?
I think one comment in response
Sure.
to that.
Do we have more than one mic in the room here?
So
I think
John
it's on.
and I wrestle a lot with this stuff. I think there's one important distinction to make between John's presentation and some of the ways in which I've used trust marks, at least in the last few months, which is John's trust marks are generally aimed for consumption by federated operators to help do the alignment of federation to federation kind of work. The trust marks that I've been focusing on are aimed for end users to help them make privacy management decisions. And so it's something that's going to percolate up through a matrix of tools and hit the eyeball of the user and help inform about whether or not to release attributes. Both are trust marks consumed by different communities. And I think the challenge for John and I think it's well doable, is to make as much alignment between his use of trust marks and our use of trust marks. And so we're going back and forth on issues like revocation, logos, signing the marks, etc. That piece should be common, even if the consumer of the mark is really different between a federated operator and an end user.
Yeah, and maybe another way of saying that also is that machine-readable trust marks, they're intended to be consumed by machinery, by automation, on behalf of the user, whether it happens in the browser, or happens at an IDP, or happens at a relying party. Jack?
I was just going to add that within TIFTM, we have had the question that we have begun discussing, because we have a number of lawyers on the group. For lawyers, trust marks have very specific meanings. And as we start to talk about these things as trust marks, we may have to come back with a different word, because that overload may actually not be the right way to think about it. The way John's going to describe it, he's going to give you his trust mark. But as we've had lawyers talk about this, they're saying we're overloading a term that may have consequences later on.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think that's part of the getting the right term to represent what we actually mean by this, is adding confusion. And that's part of the reason we're doing this. We're going to, as we go through this, you're going to see exactly what we mean by a trust mark. There's several different examples. You can have them for technical aspects. For example, FICAM SAML single sign-on profile. You can have them for different levels of assurance. You can have them for the FIPS, certain security practices, certain legal aspects, certain metadata. And we're going to show you some concrete examples that you can go through and say, that's what you mean. Now we get that. Now, do we call that a trust mark or not? Well, we call it a trust mark. Is that the right term long term? We'll have to determine if that's the right term long term. So one of the things, when we started, wrote the application for our NSTIC pilot grant, our concept of componentizing a trust framework was, we operate a trust framework called the National Identity Exchange Federation. And our concept was, well, we can take that and break it into pieces, and that's componentizing it. What we realized is that if we took our trust framework and broke it into pieces, those pieces may not be very reusable or useful to others as well. So one of the lessons learned was componentization really is only useful in the context of multiple trust frameworks to factor out common components that can be reused. So we're saying useful trust marks are ones that have the property of reusability and composability. So one of the things that we're working on through a pilot is working with folks at the CSDII and the TSP folks and the Internet 2 folks to look across other trust frameworks and figure out, and FICAM as well, what trust marks will have generalized applicability across all those communities. So you've seen this slide from Jack earlier. Not trying to eat the whole elephant at once, we started off with a set of trust frameworks and doing a deep dive, looking through the normative specifications line by line on their profiles and factoring out what might be commonality. And very often, when you think about some of these specifications, they apply to multiple what we call conformance targets. An IDP may be a conformance target, a reliant party may be a conformance target, an attribute provider may be a conformance target. And in factoring out these components, we're saying one trust mark definition, one trust mark per conformance target. So while there's many trust marks that we're building, we'll show you our analysis here, it ends up being simpler because the trust mark definitions are much simpler and smaller. As you start to show you the examples, it may be 3 or 4 pages at max for a very, very precise normative trust mark definition, rather than having to look through 100 or so pages in the normative spec to find out what applies to that level of assurance or what applies to that particular aspect or conformance target. That also helps you in change management. So as you go from, I've already implemented something. So many times we punish early adopters. We market them to get into our trust framework, into our system, and then things change below their feet. And as they change below their feet, very often we leave it up to them to figure out how to migrate and how to move to the newest and the latest and greatest. And at this point in time, we start to look at trust frameworks and federations. There's very little penetration in the marketplace today. So when you start to think about that, there's a lot more that's going to play out going forward. So a lot of the early adopters are sitting there and say, well, maybe that wasn't a good idea. Maybe we'll just wait till the ecosystem kind of figures out where to go. So we start to think about frameworks. We need to do this in a way that doesn't penalize those early adopters and builds in a migration path for them and the change that we know is naturally going to happen. Now, as we did this initial analysis, and we'll show you this, I think I'm going to ask Matt to jump out to the list here. We've found 89 distinct trust marks just from looking at that small set that we had. And what I've said in the past is, wow, that's a lot. That's complex. That's confusing. There's so many of those things. I don't believe that to be the case. I think because they are machine readable, okay, a lot of these decisions are going to be made by automation, okay? They're very, very small, very precise for a particular aspect. I view a day when we're going to have plugins in browsers that a community is going to publish their policy and how you participate in that community. You may also have a personal policy setting in a browser. All automation. You're going to hit a website, and if it's part of the health community or if it's part of the law enforcement community that I serve or so forth, that policy is going to be able to execute based on those machine-readable trust marks that are in a file on that website or in a registry. It could be either locations right there. And all that's going to happen behind the scenes, and then if it all works, the user doesn't see anything wrong. They get the green bar. And if something doesn't work or is in conflict with their own personal privacy policy or the policies of their community, that's when something pops up and says, do you want to go forward or not? So we don't have that today. And we just rely on little icons or images, which really push this to the end users to make certain decisions and judgments that are really going to be hard to scale, especially across communities. So you want to just jump out for a section, moment? Sure. Okay, so this is probably hard for you to see, but in the analysis, and
I can blow it.
why don't you talk to a couple little, talk to the spreadsheet a little bit here, and we'll.
All right. Let me see if I can open. I'm not sure how well this reads for you. So what we have here, we mentioned on the last slide 89 different trust marks that we've identified. John gave a talk back at the Atlanta Plenary, and I think the same slide showed 122. Right. And so we actually reduced it by about 25%, and a significant amount of that reduction was based on carefully analyzing requirements pertaining to our community, which is NEF, the National Identity Exchange Federation, and also requirements of the FICAM framework from the federal government, and carefully identifying where there's meaningful overlap to the point that we can componentize something and say, this overlap is exactly the same in our community as theirs. We can reduce the number of trust marks in the world by one because we no longer need two trust marks. We both do the exact same thing here. And there are some examples. Let me scroll down and show you. So I'm going to skip the first 5 or so. They're a little bit out of the context of what I think we want to talk about today. So as I highlight these, so you've got, if you're familiar with, I'm sure most people in the room are familiar with FICAM 800 or NIST 800-63, the levels of assurance, and then the FICAM framework defines specific requirements for those levels of assurance. What we've done, at this point in our analysis, is broken those down into 5 different trust marks per level of assurance, and you can see approximately how they break down. Below that, I've got. Let me scroll down and highlight some others here. So, if you're familiar with SAML and with FICAM's profile of SAML, we found that in our community, we have serving the law enforcement community, we have the Global Federated Identity and Privilege Management, or GFIPM, SAML profile. We took a very close look at how that was similar to and different from FICAM, made some changes to ours, and we came out with, look, we believe now that we align with FICAM so closely in the way that we do SAML that we don't need a separate trust mark for how GFIPM does SAML anymore. We'll just use the FICAM version. And so we've got a SAML trust mark for identity providers and one for relying parties. And this goes back to what John was saying about one trust mark per conformance target. If you're familiar with normative language and specifications, they typically talk in terms of conformance targets, and an identity provider's role in a SAML transaction is distinct from a relying party's role. And so we need a trust mark to tell the identity provider exactly what its requirements are, and a different trust mark to tell the relying party what its requirements are. But I can talk at length about these, but I don't want to go into too much detail.
I think
we can come back to this later if you want to.
I think we can. And one of the things that Matt was saying is that when we built the GFIPM, SAML Single Sign-On profile, we did that prior to FICAM existing. And it was surprising that there was a very, very large, even though we were built independently, overlap in those two. Okay? There was a couple requirements the law enforcement community required us to have in that profile that were hard requirements for us. We could not drop those. But instead of having these two things be totally different and no overlap, we defined 3 trust marks. One that was the overlap that could be used across the whole FICAM community, and then 2 little mini ones that represented the law enforcement community additions to those base. So trust marks are built to be composable and additive in terms of those requirements. I would imagine that in the health community and other communities as well, there's some different kinds of attribute sets, there's different kinds of consent rules and so forth that could be documented and added on across the communities. So basically that list of trust marks fall into one of these 8 different categories here. I used to have the numbers in there, but it keeps on changing, so I took the numbers out. And this is the picture you've seen from Jack earlier. So trust marks by themselves are good, but they need to live, what we say, inside of an overarching framework. So what does a trust mark ecosystem look like? And this is our attempt to define that not only for our community, but we think it's generalized that can apply to many communities, if not all communities. I'll walk you through it real quickly. There's this concept of trust mark defining organizations. They exist today. They're either your SDOs or they're your committees that build, like IDESG, that build guidance, but now they're going to be building normative guidance. And they will be building things called trust mark definitions. So that community defines a set of rules, conformance rules, a set of assessment processes or criteria, and what that trust mark will actually look like. We're going to show you and walk through, we're starting to build a normative specification for trust mark definitions so that there's some consistency. Without that consistency, you can't build the tooling around this. So consistency is important to get the uptake of these trust marks. Trust mark providers are your assessors. They're going to use those trust mark definitions. They're going to use the intent of the defining organization. They're going to use that intent, and they're going to follow that assessment process in order to issue a trust mark. So there's not one trust mark provider in the whole ecosystem. There's going to be lots of trust mark providers. Some of them are going to specialize in doing privacy audits. Some of them are going to specialize in doing some kind of healthcare attributes and consent audits. Some are going to specialize in interoperability testing. And so you can do multiple assessment processes as a trust mark provider, but there's going to be some consistency across these trust mark providers because the trust mark defining organization specifies the assessment process. And then communities, so that's the defining organization and the providers. And those functions span multiple communities of interest. So a community of interest then builds what we're calling a trust interoperability profile. It's a set of trust marks that are meaningful for that community. Okay? And a lot of trust marks may go across communities, like Jack was saying earlier. Here's a set of them, privacy and so forth, that are meaningful across all these communities. But that community builds what we call a TIP. And that TIP, again, is a machine-readable, searchable artifact that can be put in a registry, that there's standards that define that you can go in there and you can understand, you can search communities that have published their TIP, their interoperability profile, into these registries. Trust mark providers issue to trust mark recipients a trust mark. Now, a trust mark recipient could be an IDP, it could be an SP, it could be an attribute provider, it could be an intermediary, it could be several different kinds of actors in a federation that trust mark is relevant for. And then trust mark relying parties are parties that rely on those trust marks to do business. Okay, so if I'm an IDP and I want to make sure you have the right interoperability things, that you're doing the right privacy things, that you're a member of a certain community, that you have the right legal infrastructure, that you have the right bona fides as an official healthcare organization or membership. You'll check for those particular kinds of trust marks in the tip, and that's what the relying party will rely on those. Okay, so with the green, what we're trying to show here that there's going to be many different communities of interest that will build their own tips, that will use and be serviced by the same set of trust mark providers across communities, and they will also leverage trust mark definitions from the many SDOs and trust mark defining organizations outside of their community. Okay. And just, I know that's pretty fast going through that. If you go to the website, we have a word description and a more detailed breakdown of those different roles and how those roles interact in a potential ecosystem. One note on that slide, in the National Identity Exchange Federation, we are the federation manager, and we've got membership with Homeland Security and FBI and state and local law enforcement. Effectively today, when someone wants to onboard as an identity provider or a line party or an attribute provider, we have to do all the onboarding work. So we say, here's all the things you need to do, the interoperability testing, you do check out the bona fides of their security policies and so forth. Our goal is to not have to do all that work. I would like other organizations that are working with state and locals in other contexts to issue them trust marks and to be able to honor those trust marks, because I know there's consistency on how those trust marks were issued for a particular aspect, whether it's SAML single sign-on or privacy or security audits or so forth. So now, in order to make this all work in that framework, you need specifications, and then the technical underpinning needs to be there. So there's 3 primary specs that we're working on, and Matt's going to walk you through one just in the interest of time here. There's a trust mark spec itself, which defines what is a structure of a trust mark. What does it look like in XML? What are the attributes? How do you do revocation and so forth? The trust mark defining specification. If you're a trust mark defining organization, if you're going to build a new trust framework or a new trust mark, what does that look like? What's the regular structure so that you can build a tool? And one of the tools we're building under a pilot is an assessor tool. It's going to be an open source tool that we're going to provide out for free. And that tool will ingest any trust mark definition that follows that specification and walks the auditor through the steps for that particular trust mark. It tells the auditor what to do. For example, if it's a conformance testing on the wire, it'll say, run this conformance test, collect this piece of data from the endpoint, upload it into the assessor tool. The assessor tool will collect all that evidence, and if you meet the requirements of that trust mark definition, it'll generate the trust mark, and you can publish that into a registry. So that's one of the tools we're building for our community, but we see that as something that can be used by others as well, and it's going to be made freely available. And then there's the specification for what we call the trust interoperability profile. This is where communities would get together and say, here's the set of 10 trusts. As trust framework providers, we've already done this. A lot of these requirements are not new. It's repackaging of these requirements just a different way. So when we got this long list of trust marks, it's not new. It's just repackaged for reuse. So the trust mark definition specification, I'll hit it at a high level, and Matt will walk you through a couple examples that we're writing. Under our pilot project, we're writing about 50 of these trust mark definitions to cover FICAM and FIPS and some of the GFIPM and law enforcement use cases, but a lot of them are applicable across multiple communities. Every trust mark definition will have a section with normative conformance criteria. Okay, IDP must do this, it may do this, and so forth. It's a walkthrough. What are the specific things that you must conform to in detail, in language? It's going to all be in XML. Now, what Matt's going to show you is not in the XML form yet. Of course, we're writing the normative spec that they must all conform to. So he's going to show you some examples, and he's also going to show you where we are with the normative spec. Each of these trust mark definitions also has an assessment process. One of the problems that I see out there, I know in my community, and I believe in others as well, a lot of specs out there aren't very good specs. And until you try to actually do automated testing again with a spec, or put an assessor's guide together for a spec, you realize that there's a lot of wiggle room in a lot of these things up for interpretation. Some specs is good to have wiggle room. Some on the wire, not good to have wiggle room. So it depends really on the on the spec. And
That's one of the primary reasons why.
is,
Am I on? Okay.
Yeah.
That's one of the primary reasons why profiles of specs exist.
That's right.
Right. The FICAM profile of SAML, the GFIPM profile of SAML, other trust frameworks have profiled SAML also, but it's because SAML by itself doesn't give you interoperability very well.
Right. And so this assessment process will say, if you're going to issue a trust mark, we'll use the SAML single sign-on example, you must, as an assessor, run these interoperability tests. So in our community, we have dozens of interoperability tests to verify that you meet the SAML single sign-on conformance as an endpoint, as an IDP or a SP. And anyone who onboards must go through that test. Others self-assert that they are conforming to a particular thing. And that provides a challenge once you build this. There's an expectation that if you join a federation or the ecosystem, that things are going to kind of work together. And we're not quite there yet. And the other thing that's in the trust mark definition is the actual metadata. What does the trust mark definition look like? How do we wrap this? Who's the owner of this trust mark definition and so forth? So without more on this slide, I'm going to let Matt pull up, maybe pull up the requirements for the trust mark definition spec, and then we'll go through some examples to show them what it actually looks like.
Okay. But before I'm on here. Okay, good. Before I pull up the spec, I just want to let you know, for those who might want to follow along on your own computer or maybe at home, what I'm going to show you is already posted online on our website. So if you go to our Trustmark pilot webpage and go to the artifacts page on that website, and you'll be able to find these documents under this section right here, preliminary requirements for TDs, trust marks, and tips. And there's a series of PDF files. And so we're going to be looking at the preliminary requirements for trust mark definitions. And so this is deeper in content than the slide that we just showed, but it's not quite yet what I would call a normative specification. Our vision for a trust mark definition is it's an XML artifact that contains a bunch of different information. We, as you'll see in this document, and you're certainly free to download it and read it offline and send us comments, we have a pretty good idea of what the content of a trust mark definition needs to be to meet our needs. We're still working out what exactly the XML version of that looks like, and we're writing an XML schema for that. And that work actually is ongoing pretty well. These documents here were actually posted to our website in late January, so this information is a couple of months old. We're quite a bit ahead of this in our actual research, but this is what we can show you. This is what we have that's kind of nice to look at so far. So I'll just scroll down through, and again, I'm going to go a little bit fast, but I'll just point out some interesting things here. So the first section here is kind of introductory, tells you a little bit about what we're trying to do here. But we can look at these guiding principles in section 1.3. This is sort of things that we think a trust mark definition needs to accomplish. So as John said before, it must be machine readable. statement? Who is providing the assurance there? And I think it gets, so to me it gets back to, so who's providing the assurance, and do I trust the person making the assertion or the entity making the assertion? And so I think that's where we tie trust into this. Again, we can certainly debate as to whether trustmark is the right term, but thank you.
I think I fully acknowledge that.
So I'm sorry, we neglected Ken.
Oh, sorry, Ken.
Go ahead, Ken. I
He's
apologize.
blending in with the white in the background there.
You first, Ken.
Gray, I think, actually. So I think the challenging synthesis for everybody in the room is to take what John and Matt are talking about and combine it with the user-oriented, not machine-readable, but user-readable trust marks that we've been talking about in our privacy manager. Let me give you 2 or 3 specific examples just so you have them in your brain, because I think there's a tremendous value in reconciling these 2 approaches. And I think we're understanding that. It hurts my head to try to reconcile. I'm going to share the headache with everybody else. We're talking about an accessibility mark. We're talking about perhaps working with the ID.me people to come up with a veterans mark. And we're also talking about marks for, well, we already have a mark in our landscape for research and scholarship applications, et cetera. The one thing that I see fairly distinctive in our approaches, and I want to come back to your conformance criteria point, is that most of our marks begin with the set of attributes that the marks work with. And so for accessibility, there's the standard ITU schema of some 9 pages worth of attributes. We assume that every actor in the identity ecosystem who wants to earn the mark has to have some awareness of those attributes that are specialized. In the case of the research and scholarship mark that we use today, there are no special attributes. In the case of the VA work, there's the Department of Defense 214 schema, which is likely going to be a set of attributes that help manage behaviors associated with the veterans mark should we get there. With Prevo, there's going to be a set of attributes associated with the binding of parents to kids, for example, that Prevo may need. So the question of where we put these specialized attributes for marks is an interesting one. Again, some marks won't have them. Do we put them in the conformance criteria piece is my question to you, Matt. If we're trying to take our approach and say, okay, for us a mark begins with a set of attributes and then a set of behaviors associated with those attributes. I think we're pretty clear on that and aligned. Where do you stick your specialized attributes if you have them? And I'm sure NEAF has interesting attributes. I've seen your schema. You have interesting attributes.
So that was Ken Klingenstein, because they're asking people to identify themselves when they step up to the mic for questions. And I think as you start to look through some of these examples that he's going to show, trust marks, the conformance section will look different for conformance for a set of attributes that must be asserted than a normative protocol on the wire, than a security policy. So what we're trying to do is build a wide enough set of examples to set a template for where you would bring that in. And all those that you said, I think, could fit easily into this format. So I don't think there's anything contradictory about that. I think they can work together. Yes?
Hi, my name is Lena Kanapana. I was one of the first people involved in the SAML certification committee in the past. So as part of the SAML 2.0 discussions and going forward, we had we wanted to extend add an extra attribute, like if the interaction, whether you are an IDP or an SP, especially in the case of identity provider, if that IDP is certified, can I communicate that with the relying party as a special attribute, which Ken just mentioned? So which actually lies in the same line of your thinking in terms of machine reading, right? Technically at the interoperability protocol level. I think, but while working on many use cases and deployments, especially from an end customer perspective, you'll have a lot of challenges in terms of mapping these requirements for assurance levels between interfederations or trust federations. So just carrying a trust mark or assurance mark, whatever you want to call it, or trust cert, that's not going to really solve the problem of if I'm going between a healthcare and financial or a healthcare and government. I need to know if Google says my two-factor authentication is level 2, is the government relying party willing to accept that as at level 2, right? So when you talk about trust federations and interaction between trust federations, I think those are, when you go down to the details of the use cases that the customers are deploying today, especially a lot of SAML deployments, it is important, something to think about. I don't see that. So I saw examples. You said there may be 80 or 100 plus trust marks around, but how do you really deploy? When you go down to the deployment level, I just don't get that whole picture. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot that's going to play out over time, but let me give you, in the SAML Federation that we have for law enforcement, okay, we published a profile. I can say I don't think any two members in our federation are using the same product. It's one of those, and as we first started by deploying SHIB, a version of SHIB that we configured a certain way for SAML interoperability. And the particular attributes in the SAML assertions, it's a separate trust mark. We keep that separate from the actual conformance for the interoperability for the SAML endpoint. And what we've learned is that we had to do normative conformance testing with the reference federation that we had, or as we started putting that guidance out there, we had a community that wasn't interoperating with each other. And when something doesn't work in a federation, who do you call? Right? Is it your IDP? Is it the endpoint? Is it your local identity management system? And so forth. So we ended up developing assessment criteria for every vendor that would have to go through that. And so onboarding our federation, we've put you through that, along with all the other requirements that we had to jump on. Well, now we've got a lot of other communities that say, well, I need to talk to law enforcement, but I don't fall under that policy or that policy for criminal intelligence sharing, but I want to make sure I have interoperability. And so, okay, can we tease out of our trust framework that particular aspect for SAML interoperability for that profile and pull that out? Well, same thing with FICAM. It's harmonizing these different profiles across communities. So we've learned that there's definitely value in pulling the parts out. Now, you're going to get every trust mark in one community to be adopted by another community. That's not going to happen. But as long as we need that transparency, see, and you don't even have that transparency today in terms of the profiles, the assessment criteria, what was done, what was not done, where things don't work. And I think this is going to be, just like Matt was saying, going through this exercise with the FICAM, we end up throwing a bunch of things away because we invented things because they didn't exist. We didn't want to invent those things, but we just did because our community got together. I think you'll find that a lot of communities tend to invent things because they're not aware or they don't know how to. Sometimes it's easier to invent something than to go through the 200-page document of another community and figure out what they did. And so by making small, discrete, machine-understandable things with well-defined assessment, and because the assessment process was different for all the vendors in our law enforcement community, we couldn't trust them because the assessment process wasn't documented. What do? There's probably a lot of vendors in, but we've had people make claims that, believe it or not, weren't true. And then you had to actually go and test that. And so when you have that assessment process and that rigor, that builds, in my mind, some level of trust. There's evidence that's collected. If there's a dispute, I can go and ask for that evidence, and I can go back to the trustmark provider and see what tests they actually did. Does that mean it's going to work? Perfect interoperability? It doesn't guarantee interoperability, but it does guarantee they went through a well-defined process and collected evidence. Okay, so hopefully that helps. So Matt, I would say just scan through
recipients. So, for example, I think it's probably feasible to say that IDESG can become a trust mark defining organization for certain types of trust marks, but I'm not sure that IDESG itself wants to be an auditor and actually do the assessment process required to actually issue trust marks. But if they define the trust mark provider certification criteria for their trust marks, they might say, look, you need to go through a certain process, register with IDESG, and have us approve you to be able to issue a trust mark. And once you do that, then we will authorize you to issue trust marks on behalf of IDESG. This, as you can see in the bottom line there, it's an optional part of a trust mark definition, but it's something that I think some communities that define trust marks may want to retain control over who is allowed to actually issue those things. Because there's a certain amount of, when you decouple the trust mark definition from the trust mark provider, you realize that trust in a trust mark is actually different from trust in the entity that
Jim Fenton.
Hey.
When you've got a number of different certifiers that are generating trust marks, is there some way of making sure that there aren't name collisions and things like that to prevent multiple people from issuing things that look the same?
Yeah, well, okay, so name collision, one of the properties of the actual trust mark definitions was to be uniquely identifiable in the namespace. So, of course, you're going to have to use a URI or something that is unique in there.
Or a registry somewhere.
Or registry, exactly. But that doesn't mean two things that are named differently don't overlap, right? And so we take this marketplace approach that there's going to be overlap in these trust mark definitions, right? And there'll be some winners and there'll be some losers, and we don't have to know all that in advance, right? We're going to let what the take-up is. Some may go too far in terms of rigorous requirements that are too hard for people to adopt that particular aspect. Some may go where there's not a lot of confidence that it does much good, whether it's interoperability or privacy, and the marketplace is going to figure that out. But if we have consistency in how they're named and how they're represented, how we can discover those in our communities and across the IDSG, I think that helps to individual contributions go to the greater ecosystem.
we got Ken has a question and
So
Doug has a question. I don't know
to
who
your
showed
point,
first.
Jim, Ken Klingenstein, to your point, Jim, we have just internationalized one of our marks, this research and scholarship mark. And so it was just an in-common U.S.-centric approach, and now it's been adopted by R&E federations internationally. We've had to change a bit of the format so that we specify who did the audit. In fact, we may have some mechanisms that would allow us to summon the qualifier should you need it, but not confuse the marketplace otherwise. So typical kinds of pushing and pulls we do in technology design, there'll be one here.
Got a question from cyberspace.
Thank you. I was going to say, I hope you knew that wasn't me, but it's too hard to lug my computer around. Okay, this is a comment from Kimberly. I don't have a last name. Okay, so regarding stakeholder party, along with individual e-identities that are coming along, there is a need for the trusted assuring parties, in quotation marks, that are legally bound to a jurisdiction, like the CPA license, and quality reviews are within their states for accounting accountability. The challenge is personally assigned accountability to ensure the quality of the work is adequate for the public to trust and uniquely assignable to an entity and or trust qualified person dash signer. Did you follow all that? You didn't even read it.
Sure, that was simple.
Sorry. you want me to read it again?
No, no. Yeah. So I'm not sure I quite understand the whole question there, but let me try to interpret that, and then I do want to get through one example here because I think we got 10 minutes left. We can go for it. So I think you're saying there are some requirements in some communities to convey trust from, and maybe the certifying body, maybe it's the state or some group that certifies either doctors or CPAs or so forth. Can they be, okay, she's qualified.
Yeah.
Okay.
So she's trying to help.
Okay.
Outside of CPA/CISA, there is a weakness currently amongst most assurances where a direct implementer can then cross business lines and assure their own work, which obvious is not trustworthy. Please state the risk provided. It will help.
So is she talking about self-assertion of certifiers?
There's a weakness currently amongst most assurances where a direct implementer can then cross business lines and assure their own work, which obviously is not trustworthy.
So
Yes.
the trustmark. So in our case, we're talking about. I think she's talking about a case where the trustmark provider and the trustmark recipient are the same entity. So we term that to be a self-issued,
Self-assertion,
self-asserted trustmark.
Okay. She's got a yes, so I think that she's saying
Yeah,
yes
and so
to you.
so our model allows for that, but again, the trustmark relying party can choose whether that's a trustworthy thing. I may say, you must get a trustmark, but it must be issued by that organization over there, not by you. If you issue it yourself, I don't trust it. I only trust some other organization or some set of organizations or entities to issue trustmarks.
Yeah, we have a good picture of the tip we could bring up that I think makes that point. But I just wanted Matt to show you right here some of the trustmark definitions that we have on our website and we're working through. The ones that have a hot link on it, you can actually go and download and take a look at. Some of the other ones are in progress. We haven't built yet, but that's on the website. I want to just give you a real look at one example. We've been talking about SAML single sign-on, so maybe you can walk through that one.
Yeah, sure. So I'll just preface this by saying these sample trustmark definitions are actually about 3 months old. We finished these up more or less before the holidays and posted them a couple of months ago. So some of these are actually out of date, but they still provide a good example for what the structure of a trustmark definition looks like. And well, with one caveat, which is when we defined these, we didn't yet have, and we still don't have it 100% complete. We didn't have an XML schema for what exactly a trustmark definition should look like in XML. So as a first step, we just wrote them up as a series of Microsoft Word documents, and they're available as a basically every one of these trustmark definitions is just a zip archive. You can download it, open it up, and this is more or less what you'll find when you look inside it. So we talked about conformance criteria. I'll just open this, and I have to drag over to my other screen. So here's an example of conformance criteria for, this is actually GFIPM SAML trustmark, which is different from FICAM SAML trustmark. But as I noted when we started, when we were showing the list of all the trustmarks, this is one that we've actually deprecated because it's so similar to the FICAM trustmark. We made some minor adjustments, pulled a few things out of it, and then we just deprecated this in favor of a unified FICAM trustmark that we can use for the purpose of SAML single sign-on. So you can look at these conformance criteria, and you can see every one of them has a citation. I'll go ahead and highlight the citation for the first one. So you could actually go and look in a spec and see, okay, this is where we got this, and so that's what your conformance criteria looks like. I'm going to hop out of this for a second just to show you the assessment process, which is
those will be wrapped with in XML as machine readable, but this is
right
pre-spec version.
So, and here again, I would say that some aspects of what I'm showing you have actually changed in the last few months as we've learned a bit more about, more or less this is what you'd find if you looked in a trustmark assessment process. And so we've got several different categories in here, but you can see, let me go back to number one, basically every assessment step is asking an assessor a question. So, one of the things that we care about in GFIPM is usability. So if you're going to protect your IDP endpoint with a certificate in order to make the user experience as good as possible, you need to use a certificate which is issued by a certificate authority that's trusted by default in browsers. So we're asking the assessor, is that the case? And then we're asking the assessor to basically submit an attachment showing us basically as proof in case there's ever an audit on this trust mark. Let's ask the assessor for some evidence, to provide some evidence that he actually completed this assessment step and that the assessment step was satisfied by the applicant.
And each type of trust mark will have a different kind of evidence. Things that are on the wire, you're uploading a certificate here, you may be uploading a packet. Other ones, you're uploading references out of a security policy or an audit that was done and so forth. Question. Oh no, is this going to be a trust mark question?
No, actually,
Could you state your name? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, my name is Mary Hodder, and I'm actually more involved in the user experience and usability side of things. And I actually just started to realize when you were showing the list of various what you're calling trust marks that there is an overlap in concept with a thing that we do in usability or in usability land all the time, which is heuristics. So in the heuristics model, if you have a piece of technology and you want to see how it maps and where the errors are, or if there's agreement, you encode the heuristics in some machine readable code, and you run them against each other. Basically, you can also do a human audit of the heuristics against the technology. But what I realized is that that there's a way where you're doing essentially a heuristics review of whatever it is you would like to be trustable or assured against a set of requirements that are part of the trust mark or whatever. And so I wanted to throw that out there because I don't know if you've ever looked at heuristic systems, but it seems to me that that there's a lot of overlap, and there's decades of building those kinds of systems, and so I throw that out as a possible thing to map to, or for you to look at and see things that have come before. I'm sure there's a lot of things in the identity world that have come before, but it seems to me that you're trying to do something that's very closely related. Maybe
There's a lot of parallels with this.
Okay.
And that's the good news is when there are parallels like that, same kinds of techniques and methodologies that work to solve other problems, it gives you some confidence in this.
Right.
So as we looked at things like PKI frameworks and those kind of things in terms of who the actors are, whether you're a big fan of PKI or not a big fan, it has worked for things like SSL and websites and everything on the
Right.
internet, and it has scaled to internet scales.
So so in the heuristics model, the thing that you're doing is you're basically looking to see if a set of requirements can be assured. And so it seems to me that, for me, that's another framework to say, this is much more about assuring a set of principles. The other question that I had is, at the very beginning, you listed off a bunch of different types of trust marks that you had, and you had usability as one of the 8 categories. And I was wondering if you would show us a usability trust mark.
Can we do that offline? We've got 1 minute left before we have to wrap this thing up. I think we have. And we had one more question from Kay back there.
Well, there were several questions. I know you're out of time. I don't know
Okay.
if Ann Rakuya Robbins had a chance to ask her question. She asked, doesn't that create an underclass that self-attest? Where are questions of affordability to the enterprise discussed?
Go to the tip, the picture in the presentation for the tip. And so we realize this is a lot for a 1 hour birds of a feather. There's a lot of details. We'd like to have an ongoing conversation. We're certainly will be here for the rest of the week as well to dive down into detail. We encourage you to go to our website, take a look at the website, comes with specific questions. I think this might go towards answering that question. Communities, relying parties, identity providers will publish a TIP, a trust interoperability profile, and there's enormous respect for that as well. And that says, what trust marks do the IDPs in this community need? Who must they be issued by? Are you allowed to self-assert those trust marks or not? And so that provides that trust anchor in terms of whether you can actually, and whether you allow self-assertion. In some low assurance environments, you may allow self-assertion of facts. We have that at low levels of assurance today. But in other environments, you don't want that self-assertion. In fact, you want them asserted from well-known trust mark providers that are well-known to a particular community of interest, whether it's law enforcement, health, or so forth, and have maybe been through a certification process like for certain trust marks in the IDESG world, put on a website, go through some kind of certification process, and then if you want to claim that you are adherent to the IDESG principles, you have to get a trust mark from one of these trust mark providers. So I think we're out of time, and I know there's probably lots of questions still, but thank you for listening, and come talk to us offline, and we will definitely need to consider about the messaging or the term trust mark, assurance mark, or something that may be more appropriate and better for better usability. Right? There you go. Thank you.
Thank you.
And